if we predict error signals, I can correct, right? My angle, the error in angle is still relatively reduced, while if I generate actions, I disable my feedback control, right? I cannot compensate anymore. So then we show this on real robots that are generalized to the real world. This is the perturbator. So now we have a prediction. Because we say, no, the brain is not only virtualizing perceptual states, it's also virtualizing error signals. It's sending error signals to the periphery to fool all these very primitive control systems to do their job. So, this was a prediction, let's test it. Again, it worked from Chris Tizell. Chris had observed in the cerebellum that a naive animal would show a single error response, unconditioned response, to an air puff or a shock. But after learning, he would see a double error response, exactly as our model predicted. And Chris was really, very worried about what this double response meant. And now our prediction is that this is due to a top-down error, a predicted error signal that comes probably from the frontal cortex. So now we want to use this in control. So we built some models, right? Models are there to be wrong, but now you have an idea. The brain cares about generating counterfactual errors. It's imagining errors to fool primitive control systems to do their job. So let's see, can we use this in stroke rehabilitation? As you know, stroke is a big problem. Majority of disability-listed life years in neurological disease are due to stroke. This is a massive problem for our society. So this is the main clinical issue that we target right now. And we built a rehabilitation system that projects users into virtual reality, where we can exercise all the different principles that we developed and identified in our theory in training protocols. So I don't care about virtual reality, but I think it's the most appropriate tool to deliver the training principles I care about. So in this specific case, okay, let's skip the video. You see one of our patients working with the system, but you can find it on Euronews. This is just to show you that the system I quickly gave you a view on actually works. So here we measure upper extremity function with the Fugl-Meyer scale, which is muscle synergies, like can you make these kinds of movements, right? So are you biomechanically controllable? And that's the upper scale here. The lower one is the Kahai scale, which looks at function, like can you hold something, can you button a shirt? Okay. What we see with our intervention is 3 weeks, 3 days a week, 20 minutes, which is really homeopathic compared to most of the other approaches. We see that from 3 weeks to 3 years, we have a significant impact on both of these scales. Okay, so this approach works. But now we want to push it one step further with our insight derived from understanding counterfactual error. Can we exploit this in the clinic? So we look at a specific problem, which is called acquired non-use. What that means is, if you have a stroke patient, they have a paretic arm they cannot really use, you will see that with time they will use this arm less and less, even though biomechanically they could. So it's an acquired deficit. Again, it's an environmental factor that influences how they use this limb. It's not brain related. So for instance, if you have a simple reaching task, you will see that the healthy arm starts to invade the workspace of the paretic arm. So in this case, for this group of patients, about 24 chronic stroke patients, you see that there's a bias of -6 degrees, where the healthy arm starts to enter the space of the paretic arm in a simple reaching task. The standard treatment since the 90s is what's called constraint-induced movement therapy. So let's immobilize the healthy arm. We will force the patient to use their arm, their paretic arm. So in this way we train it and we will overcome the acquired non-use. Unfortunately, Gert Kwartel here at AMC did a rather large comparison between constraint-induced movement therapy and standard treatment and showed there's no difference. Okay? So it actually doesn't work. Even though it's a very demanding therapy, lasts many months, many hours a day, and actually not effective. So what do? We have our idea of counterfactual error. So I can manipulate the error feedback to the brain. So what we do here in this task, if Belen performing this task here, we do what we call intention-compatible amplification. So if I move my paretic arm to this red point here, and this is my target. I have a certain error. But in the virtual reality, I enhance the movement to the green point. So I artificially reduce the error feedback to the brain, and our prediction was this should then reduce the error feedback to the motor control system. And as a result, overcome acquired non-use. And this is so, of course I wouldn't mention it otherwise. We do 2 sessions here of 300 trials each. Only for 100 trials we turn on this amplification, and you see we can shift back hand symmetry to 0. Okay? So they're perfectly balanced again. And even in the washout we still have a residual effect. So this shows you that we can really get mileage. We can get mileage from building on these theoretical principles in the clinic. Which in turn, of course, gives us valuable feedback on how the brain is organized as an architecture. Now, stroke is not only about motor deficits. We have many other domains in which have deficits that will emerge over many different periods of time. It's a complex, dynamical picture in stroke. And we want to address all of them. So for that, we built many different protocols that are now being used in many different places, because we are delivering these automatically over a computer system, and by now we have delivered 6,000 hours of therapy only with computers, okay? Fully automated. And it's better than what you can get in the hospital with an occupational therapist, right? Also because we can be much more precise in our diagnostics. So this is about 70,000 sessions over the last 4 years, and we're closing now 3,000 patients. So every day we treat dozens of patients. And for that, we built an integrated treatment system that really follows the patient from the moment they enter the hospital. They do the inpatient treatment, they take the system along when they go home again, and then we equip them as well with wearables and apps for continuous information exchange. We have online monitoring of their performance, and also automatic adjustment of the training protocols based on the results that we obtain from our patient. And if patients reach or hit certain boundaries in expected recovery channels, we engage with the clinician. What's interesting about that, is I think that's also relevant for our discussion on urban mental health. These are serious technological exercises. So to build these kinds of pipelines, there's a lot of engineering and technology development that you have to think about. It's not like, oh, let's program an app and we throw it out there, right? It's a big design challenge and programming challenge that we are trying to master. But the outlook of that is, so also to come to the end, at the heart of this system, we see that we're going to have to rely on much more individualized, detailed multi-scale models of every patient. Right? So what you really see is that you have a multi-stack description of your patient from their genome to their behavior, which will form the core for your ability to diagnose and predict. This is the best way, we believe, to overcome the huge variability we face in the treatment of these patient groups. So for that, we built a neuroinformatics pipeline, which is called BrainQ. You can get the free version, which you can just download. So where do we start? With a simple task. The task is simple, but actually there were a lot of ideas behind it that maybe were partially wrong, but at least it got us to the right place. Right? Because what we know, the cerebellum has a large density of CB1 receptors responsive to cannabis. So does the frontal cortex. And why we looked at this interaction between procedural and executive control is because we know, by virtue of changes in CB1 presence, you start to rebalance the system. And we wanted to find a simple way to identify that, and that's why we built a simple task. So the brain theory led us to a very specific view on diagnostics that we now are rolling out to different centers in Catalonia. So we're also going to generalize to other deficits in stroke, which is one of the problems, like with right now we're discussing addiction, massive challenge. So to conclude, what I wanted to show to you is that to build models is one thing, but to bring them to the clinic is, I think, almost like an obligation we have. Right? To write papers is one thing, but we also all know 90% of papers will never be read by anyone. We want to give real-world validity to the science we do, and we can find that in the clinic, we can find that in these challenges in urban health. So I wish you good luck with your fantastic project, and I hope you can find this synergy between the basic science and the clinical application of urban mental health. Thank you very much.
Is this on? Yeah. I think there is room for one or two questions. No.
Maybe if you said well, then you said.
Okay, then we immediately continue. Be aware at the end we have really time to discuss all kind of things and add and maybe ask some more questions as well. Okay, now it's time to introduce next speaker. The next speaker is Danny Bosboom, Professor Bosboom, who is a professor of psychological methods, and he's also chairing the psychological method lead at the University of Amsterdam. And he received several prestigious awards and also a Vici. He's well known on his work on networks and psychopathology. And we are very, very happy that he also contributes to urban mental health, and moreover is willing to give a presentation right now while feeling a little bit flu-like, so hopefully we can support you a bit in giving the presentation. Danny.
Yeah, thank you, Claudia. Thanks for the invitation. It is an honor and a pleasure to be here today at the opening of this new research program. I think it is a very special moment, and maybe even an historical moment, because I think this is the first time that I'm aware of that such a diverse set of disciplines tackles the problem of mental health in a urban setting. You know, combining insights from psychology, but also from sociology and biology and systems modeling, and that's, I think, a really special moment. And I'm also happy because it aligns a lot with what we have been doing in the past few years in trying to develop a view of psychopathology as a complex system that arises out of network structures and mutually reinforcing problems, and that's what I would like to say a little bit about. Now, my background is not in psychopathology or in psychiatry. My background is in psychometrics, so my day-to-day bread and butter business is how to think about the relation between things you can see, basically, but you're not really interested in, and things you're really interested in, but you can't really see, in particular theoretical constructs like depression or anxiety, but also intelligence or personality. And the idea of thinking of psychopathology as a complex system, as a network, actually arose from problems that we encountered in thinking about this. And if you consider the way that research operates, research into psychopathology operates, then it's evident that a lot of work in practice, if not in theory, but always in practice, departs from a disease analogy, where symptoms are created by underlying disorders, more or less like symptoms of, say, lung cancer, like pain on the chest and coughing up blood, would be produced by an underlying latent problem in the lungs in those things. And these symptoms are outward expressions of this central pathogenic pathway. And That's what we want to know, that's what we want to intervene on, that's what we organize our research about. And if you look at the way that psychopathology research is structured, this is very much how it works. There are people studying schizophrenia, there are people studying depression, there are people studying anxiety, and in each case the symptomatology is aggregated into some sort of a diagnosis, and that's the level at which we're looking. But if you think about it, there's a couple of strange things about the notion that there is an underlying latent problem that produces these symptoms. One thing is, obviously, that even though trillions of dollars and euros have been invested in this and many, many years of research, we haven't really been able to find any of these central pathogenic pathways. Of course, there's a lot of stuff that has been discovered. I'm not saying that it's all worthless or wrong, but we haven't made discoveries in the order of, insulin deficiencies in diabetes or molecular structures in cancer. We haven't been able to find that kind of pathway. Also, it isn't clear that we can actually separate the symptomatology from the underlying problems. It's possible, I hope not, but it's possible that if I went to the doctor now, the doctor would put me into a MRI machine and would say, I'm sorry to tell you that you have a tumor in your lungs. It's possible. Even though I have no symptomatology. But in, for instance, psychopathology, this would be remarkable. Right? If I imagine going to the psychiatrist, and the psychiatrist puts you into an fMRI machine and says, you feel fine, and says, I'm sorry to tell you, Dr. Borsboom, you have a clinical depression. Oh, I'm feeling good, I'm eating well, I'm sleeping well. So there's no separability. And also, if you look at the causes of the symptomatology in psychopathology, then you often find other symptoms. So a symptom of depression is fatigue. Well, what's a good reason for being fatigued? Not sleeping. Sleeping is another symptom of psychopathology. And if you look at that, at the DSM or these kind of systems from this perspective, then suddenly you see that the whole space of psychopathology is composed of this kind of relations. And that gives rise to a fundamentally different view of how symptoms relate to disorders. Namely, they are components of a network. And that's the idea of a network model. So in the simplest non-trivial case, the idea is that the things we call symptoms in psychopathology basically are problems that aren't really symptoms, but it's hard to change this kind of terminology, that fuel each other. So if I develop certain problems, they will fuel other problems. If I don't sleep, I get tired. If I get tired, I make mistakes. If I make mistakes, I feel bad about myself. If I feel bad about myself, I may worry about that. I may not sleep anymore. Maybe I start drinking to get some sleep. And this starts rolling around and builds into disorders. And so in the simplest non-trivial case that we developed in our group, we just said, okay, let's take a couple of symptoms. Let's say they are connected such that if one arises for some reason, it increases the chance that another symptom arises. And in the simplest non-trivial case, you have the probability that a symptom turns on, that it's affected. There is outside forces that can influence a symptom, and then there are, within the symptom network, there are connections that basically prosaic connections of the kind, if you don't sleep, you get tired, if you hear voices, that's frightening, if you use an illegal substance, there's a good chance you'll encounter law enforcement. And if you start thinking about this, then suddenly everything changes. Because if there is no latent underlying cause and there is no central pathogenic pathway, we have to answer the question, how do the architectures of these kinds of networks predispose some people to develop one kind of disorders and others into something else? We have to think about what composes these network connections. It's a monumental error of thought to think that they're all in the brain. Of course not. Many of these connections go through the environment. They are infused by culture. They stand under the influence of societal norms. And that's exactly the reason that I think urban mental health is such an important addition to the program. If you start thinking about these network structures, then it's evident that if there are differences between people or within people to develop certain disorders, and there's basically nothing else than a network like this, then it has to be something in the architecture of these problems, the way the problems feed each other, that determines whether a person is resilient or is sensitive to perturbations. And one hypothesis that we've been pursuing in our group is that this has to do with the strength of the connections between the problems. Right? So there are people who are really good sleepers, like my wife. My wife always sleeps. She doesn't always sleep, but when something bad happens, she will, nevertheless, her sleep is really strong. Whereas I'm a person, you know, if I worry whether I've done right today or I'm sensitive to these things, so I lie awake and I ruminate. So the responsivity of the sleep node, for instance, is different for me and for my wife. And the idea is that if you have a personality or an environment or a biological constitution that makes certain problems more prone to activate other problems, then you are at risk for developing a mental disorder in a certain direction. And one of the surprising things that we found, it's not so surprising if you know these models, but when we started this kind of modeling, was that if we had a weakly connected network and we just shot a misery at it, so external forces that perturb the problems and then that would spread. Actually, Claudia van Borpel, who is here, was simulating this, and when she increased the connection strength between the problems, so now you are somebody who is more prone to develop another problem in response to the first problem, that you get this phenomenon called hysteresis, where the system can tip into a depression or a psychopathological state, and if you then remove the stressor, it doesn't get back anymore. And the reason for this is that in strongly connected networks, you basically get, you can think of this as a dynamical landscape, and if you have a healthy network, then the state is kicked over all the time because of external forces, but always rolls back to its stable state, which is health in this case. If you have a very strongly connected network, then if your perturbations are strong enough, there's a tipping point and another attractor opening up. And if you end up there, then your problems are so strong and they keep on infusing each other that you cannot spontaneously get out of it. And this, I think, is a very plausible account of what a mental disorder really is. It's not an abnormality, a primary abnormality in the body or the environment. There is no central pathogenic pathway. It is a stable state that you end up in because your problems are so big and have so much influence on each other that you cannot get out of it anymore. So where does that leave us? What are mental disorders if they are these things? One idea is that mental disorders are regions of more tightly connected symptoms, and this is a network space of the entire DSM, that have a greater tendency to activate each other. And that's why we see in people that we don't all get mad in completely unique ways. Right? There is systematicity in what we see in the clustering and the organization of symptoms in mental disorders. It also implies, of course, that if there are individual differences in the connectivity patterns that give rise to these stable states, then that's where we have to seek the the etiology of the disorders and the reasons why somebody, one person is more liable to develop one disorder than another. So that's a different way of thinking. Now, in my group, so as I said, I'm a psychometrician rather than a clinical psychologist by training, and of course we like statistics. We're a bit weird in that respect. So we have developed a lot of methodology that also allows you to develop these pretty pictures actually of which symptoms tend to co-activate with other people's symptoms, and that's not really I cannot claim too much credit. It's especially Laurens Waldorp, Sascha Epskamp, Claudia van Borkel, and Jonas Hasselbeck, who have been really influential in developing these models. And they are also operational for all of you to use. So basically all the standard empirical research designs can now be networked. For instance, you can have a set of people who have a symptom report, and you can produce a network like the first step of determining which problems are connected to which other problems. So basically the architecture of the system for a person or for a group. And we just spoke on this, Adela Esfaran, who is running our network summer and winter schools. We were talking about this, that it would be nice for the urban mental health people to organize a special autumn school or fall school. We have to talk about that, where everybody can get together and we can walk through these methodologies, if you like. The network perspective is, of course, in the end, it actually is bad news, right? Because you would rather have a latent disease that you can, you can get to. That's of course the easiest thing to do, and we know from complex systems, well, they're not called complex for no reason, that they're really complicated in the sense that they're hard to understand and hard to control. But I do think we really need to make new movements in this thinking about this. And one of the things is what Paul already said, is that a pretty picture is just a pretty picture. You need to start thinking about the actual time scales involved, the actual ways in which the symptoms or the problems interact, the way they interact on different time scales, the way they interact with respect to the outside world, the environment, and the culture in which somebody lives. Because of course the person, the individual human being, is constantly reshaping its own connectivity patterns in reaction to observations and behavior. People change their environment, and that changes their representations, and that changes their brains, and that changes their behavior. So I think there's real promise in trying to bring these worlds together and to see if we can build multi-scale networks, both in terms of size and in terms of time scales and in terms of psychology, biology, or sociological viewpoints in bringing this together. So I think that these network approaches are a good starting point, and that's exactly where we are now. I think we are at a starting point. We have a new way of thinking about what the mental disorders are and how we should study them. But we are not yet at the point that we are able to formulate dynamical models that are also give rise to controllable experiments or predictions, and that's exactly, I think, where we should be moving now. The network toolbox, however, is empirically operational and there for you to use. And I think that urban mental health offers excellent opportunities for developing these theories and really making new steps in understanding mental disorders.
Thank you, Danny. And I think it's fair to say that the network approach really has gained momentum. No, there's time for a question, I guess. And I just want to briefly mention that it's not only within urban mental health this is an important approach, but there's also a national gravitation project where University of Amsterdam also participates, led by Maastricht University. So there's really going to happen a lot in redefining mental disorders from this network approach, where we are part and very happy to be part. Questions for Danny? There's a question in the back. Is there a microphone?
Can I just speak pretty loudly?
Yeah.
Can you all hear me? Well, thank you for the presentation. I know I'm a little bit of a short, but I'm looking, for example, at different neighborhood characteristics, and we don't really know what is it. Is it the neighborhood socioeconomic position that has a bigger impact on, let's say, air pollution, on depression, and anxiety? And what I think is interesting about your approach is that maybe you use it to look at neighborhood characteristics or environmental characteristics and kind of try to see, I guess, how they cluster, right? And then kind of get an idea where interventions can be targeted towards. Is that possible for social network, or is it, because I know you talk about it's an application in psychology, but beyond that, it's people things.
You're now talking about neighborhoods where people live and the impact of that on developing certain kinds of psychopathology. Yeah, I think that as a sort of meta template, network approaches can be useful to think about that, because especially if you can identify the problems that you're interested in that impose these networks, you can think of each problem as being activated from the outside, and you can build models for how that works. And that can of course be at different levels. If you live in a certain neighborhood, it can be, for instance, more difficult to get certain kinds of food. Right? That's one level of impact. It can also be that that living in a certain neighborhood fuels a certain perception of your own role in society. And this clearly can also change the representation that you have about yourself and your desirable level of functioning, for instance. So that's a psychological route in which this could happen. And one of the interesting things about network approaches is that if you have a large data set in which you can very easily, you can have these things at various levels, you can see at which points they basically enter into the system of psychopathology, and that can bring you to new ideas and new theories of how the environment actually operates. But I have to say, it's also, of course, a feedback system at that level. People also behave in a certain way in response to these things, and that, of course, changes the neighborhood itself. So there's feedback at all levels, and I think that's completely central in this kind of thinking.
Thank you, Danny. We need to move on. Wonderful.